Okay, good morning, people. Good morning. Good morning. For whatever reason, one of my computer hadn't picked up. Frances, were you starting? Okay, anyway. We're going to look today at the Caravaggio's followers. As you know, Caravaggio had a great impact on painters that followed him. And we have two trends. In the early 17th century, we have Caravaggio on one side, and we have the Carracci on the other. And of course, we always have people in the middle that are not really defined. But these are the two main trends. Caravaggio happened because of his travels, happened to have quite a following, not only in Rome, in Naples, and then with other painters that saw his works, and we'll see that he has an international following too. So the most important follower is Oratio Gentilesti, that literally during the time that Caravaggio was working in Rome. It's the day of, anyway, that's not mine. Oratio was born in Tuscany in 1563, son of a goldsmith, and we see that quite often that goldsmiths' children sometimes turn into painting. He took the name of Gentileschi after a sojourn in Rome where he stayed with an uncle with that name. His original name was Lomi. From around 1600, which means when Caravaggio starts having religious commissions, he's going to be very influenced right away. He's going to really be attracted by that more dramatic, more emotional type of paintings. And after, of course, Caravaggio leaves Rome, he's going to develop style that is more his own and takes some of the Tuscan lyricism back. He moves to Genoa in 1621, and then from Genoa to Paris in 24. He had many children, 3 sons and a daughter that we will talk extensively about. Accompanied by his 3 sons, he's going to be called to England, where he's going to work and actually finish his life. He will die in England in 1639, and he's buried in Queen's Chapel at Somerset House. He's quite a nice painter, but what is quite interesting is if he was very famous during his time, he's going to be starting the 1960s. He's going to be overshadowed little by little by his daughter, Artemisia, who had been kind of forgotten for a while. And we'll see how many of her paintings are coming out right now. Because she had been dismissed. Many of her paintings had been attributed to other people and so on. This is one of the first work that I want to show you, which is the David contemplating the head of Goliath. And this is a lovely painting dating back to around 1610. It's actually a painting on copper, and that explains its absolutely beautiful condition. If you don't bend the copper is going to stay in very good condition for a long time. And the painting has a glow that you rarely find with paintings on canvas or on panel. That painting is directly influenced by Caravaggio. And here you see one of the very late paintings by Caravaggio of St. John the Baptist. And you have that similar mood in it. So it's not so much in the composition, but more in the atmosphere. That painting that Caravaggio had painted while in Naples was destined to Scipione Borghese, and reflects a moment where Caravaggio is being pursued by people from Malta. He is not in good health because he's being badly wounded. And this is just before he decides to go back to Rome, where he knows he's going to be forgiven. So what we see here is not a victorious David. It's not the David who is ready to fight. He's not the one who just feels so well because thanks to the help of God, he's been vanquished, that huge guy that was Goliath. But it's almost like he's reflecting on death. It's a very pretty painting. He made multiple type of paintings. This is one of the Danae. He did a few of these. This was commissioned in 1621 by Giovanni Antonio Sauli. Sorry for that. That's something with the projector. And Sauli actually commissioned a series of paintings. This is one of the only one that is left that we have identified by Oratio. It shows, of course, that very famous tale of Danae being impregnated by a shower of gold. This is part of the love stories of Jupiter, and not being able to impress on her personally, then he finds different ways of approaching them. And this one, of course, always look at it one way. When you have a nude of a woman, there are good excuses to show a nude. And of course, it had to be part of mythology. So showing Venus or showing one of the loves of Zeus was a good reason to show a nude, and of course would delect the eyes of people that commissioned these works. As I mentioned often, these were, by the way, typically exhibited in rooms that were dedicated just for men. It would be the library, or it would be another room. And if not, it would be protected by a drape that it would be drawn when women were around, because women were not supposed to see this. He, of course, also did some religious painting. This is one of the Annunciation that he did. There we find an influence from Correggio. There is that kind of finesse that was not part of what Caravaggio's vocabulary was at that time. But the very beautiful red drapery at the back is very typically northern, because these very saturated colors were what the northerners would do. As we mentioned, he went to France. We have very few works that he did over there. This happened around 24, 25. The work shows here public felicity triumphant over dangers. This was part, of course, of a mural. It's canvas, but adapted on the mural. Again, very beautiful colors. Oratio likes this combination of blues and yellows that are so compatible and really reinforce one and the other. And one of his most known painting, The Lute Player, this was done probably at his arrival in London. He became court painter to Charles I, and as I mentioned, remained there until he died. In fact, when you see the work of Oratio and all the way that his numerous travels, this is one way that the Caravaggio style spread around northern Italy and France and England. The chiaroscuro, and often the faces that are no more idealized, but are more regular faces that you can find around you. He was quite admired in the English court, and many Englishmen collected his work. So what we see is a young girl, that kind of, again, that yellow, beautiful yellow, ochre yellow, that dress. She's seated with her back towards us, and on the table are a violin and two music scores. And then she's holding a lute. And the lute often had that connotation of love. It's when you see a lute there, there's always some courtly affairs around. She also has an attitude that is very typical of a musician, is having the ear close to the instrument, and is to really appreciate the vibrations and the sound that are emitted by the instrument. Lovely painting of a Madonna and Child made in the 1630s. Very nice perspective with the face. It's almost a foreshortening and delicate view of, it's almost like Jesus, Mary is discovering the beauty of the child. Very soft painting. Color scheme has changed. As you can see, it's in purplish and the kind of light green. This is an attitude that he already had used in a previous painting, the Finding of Moses. So sorry, I'm going to bring my own projector next time. We can find the same attitude here with the attendant to the wife of the Pharaoh. This is when they find Moses floating on the Nile River. And you can see this has been picked up right away by it, with the difference that you don't have the same pearl and of course the color scheme. But very nice painting again that was made during his time in England. As I mentioned before, his daughter overshadowed him, though he was a very talented painter. But I think she comes with more impact. She's more powerful in her works. Let's talk a little bit about women artists, because this is something very dear to my heart, is the fact that women have very long been forgotten. Who were the women that were artists? Nuns in learned monasteries. We have to realize that the monasteries, the nunneries, were quite widespread during the Middle Age and during the Renaissance. It was often for women a refuge from marrying a husband they didn't want to marry. Don't forget that women had no choice. The husband was imposed onto them, and very often quite a bit older. And passing from the house of their father to the house of their husband was not always a fun thing. So many found refuge in the monasteries. Sometimes too, they were put in the monasteries. For example, in Venice, the dowries became so expensive, so large, that only the eldest daughter could get married with a dowry and the others would be put in a convent. So we have a lot of women that go into monasteries where they actually experience a much freer life than they would in a home, because they could sing, they could write, they could do all kinds of things that in a household they were not allowed. And this seems strange to us because we see the reverse right now. So through the ages, we have seen many women that were manuscript illuminators and painters since the Middle Ages, but they didn't sign. So most people have no idea who did this. We have names that became famous, like Hildegard von Bingen, Gerhard of Landsberg, St. Catherine of Bologna, Guda, Sister Plotianelli that we talked about last semester. And these are unusually well documented. Hildegard von Bingen became the abbess, so the leader of the monastery where she was. And not only did she write, illustrate her manuscript, but also wrote music that is still played nowadays. Noble women with exceptional education, and we have some examples of Anisba Anguissola and Lucia Anguissola, her sister. Women born into a family of artists, and that's often the case. This is when, as a child, she would be roaming around the workshop of the father. And if they had talent, they would take brushes and start showing their talent. For that, we have many in the north, Levina Terling, Katharina van Hemesen, and then in Italy, Marietta Robusti, who was the daughter of Tintoretto and unfortunately died very young. Artemisia Gentilesti, of course, Elisabetta Sirani, we'll talk about her later because she's born in the 1630s, and Lavinia Fontana. So the idea we have, that women were, a respectable woman was expected to be virtuous, pious, and obedient to God and her father, of course, and husband. And so if an artist failed to meet these standards, it could mean the end of her career. And this is the case of a lovely sculptor, Properzia de Rossi, who wasn't following the rules, and she literally had, sent her career to waste because of her attitude, more liberated attitude. Just an idea of what some of the great writers of the Renaissance said. Boccaccio said that these achievements were worthy of some praise. We're talking here about De Claris Mulieribus, a book that he wrote about the 150 most famous women that were part of mythology or history. That was all for him. There were not more than 150. So that these achievements were worthy of some praise, for art is very much alien to the mind of women. And these things cannot be accomplished without a great deal of talent, which in women is usually very scarce. So thank you, Boccaccio.
Was he married?
Probably not. Alberti wrote, and he wasn't married either, but he wrote a lot about family. A woman worthy of praise must show first of all in her conduct modesty and purity. Women are almost all soft, slow, and therefore far more useful when they sit still and watch over things. It's laughable now, but you have to realize that's why women had to look downward. They couldn't look straight in people's eyes. A whole series, they were fine as long as they shut up. Castiglione in Il Cortegiano wrote almost all the attributes and accomplishments necessary to the male courtier were also declared appropriate to the female. But he added that again, they had to be very modest and not intrude in the men's world. We talked about Boccaccio, and in his famous book on famous women, he singles out Marcia, who was painting a self-portrait of her. And you can see that on the illustration to the left. To the whole book, there was a fabulous response by Christine de Pizan during the Renaissance, who herself was the daughter of a scholar in Paris, and who lost her husband, leaving her alone with 2 children. And she was extremely talented and started writing to the point that she was able to make a living. And her response to Boccaccio was to write faits d'armes et de chevalerie, so these deeds of weapons and chivalry, where she sees that women should live in the kind of citadel just between themselves without men, that they would be much happier. And then you see that there's that illustration of a citadel with women and bows and arrows and so on going against the guys that are trying to take over the citadel. And this was just a wonderful response to what Boccaccio said. And she shows herself here in that illustration, conversing with Minerva. So talking about the merits of women. Now, why were women so forgotten for so long? And it's literally the feminist movement in 1964-65 that brought back a lot of these artists to the surface, where they had, as I said, many of their painting had been misattributed, and they really, for example, on the auction market, they were fetching very little prices. Once they started accepting the idea, and Artemisia was one of the first ones to come to the surface, it changed. So until the second part of the 20th century, the art world had been dominated mostly by male art historians. And that explains one thing, and male executives in museums. I remember myself being a young girl, I wasn't yet a woman, and my father telling me, you know, only men are able to have genius. And that's something that really revolted me, because he loved music and so on. And for him, only men were able to have that very genius mind. So men who wrote the history of art developed a canon of great artists and narrative that connected great art and masculinity. Male artists were the subject of most books and research, and museums highlighted these well-known male artists. Art by women was often overlooked or considered as exception, fell into obscurity, disrepair, or museum storage. In many cases, art by female artists was attributed to a better-known male artist. This is the case, for example, in the Netherlands with Judith, who is a wonderful painter, and most of her works were for a long time attributed to Frans Hals. Once they discovered that it wasn't Frans Hals, the price went down precipitously. Not anymore, but that was the case. And this is really important. Museums such as the Rijksmuseum or the Uffizi did not display works by female artists until very recently. When I was at the Rijksmuseum in the 90s, no, in the 2000, I think, there was not one woman that was exhibited at the Rijksmuseum. And the Uffizi has only now added paintings by Artemisia and even by some other women. There's one room where they finally show some women artists. So all this you can imagine, it's a multiplicity of things that made women really completely forgotten. So just a quick idea, I kept the big names on top. So Cimabue, Giotto, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael. And then you have here these artists that I've already talked about before. Sophonisba Anguissola, who met Michelangelo and was quite appreciated by him. Did some wonderful work. Marietta Robusti, as I mentioned, the daughter of Tintoretto, who was his favorite assistant, was asked to go and become the court painter to the king of Spain. And he refused and quickly married her to one of his assistants. And unfortunately, she died almost immediately in childbirth. And he could never be consoled. And then Artemisia Gentilesti that you see down here. So let's talk about Artemisia. She was born in Rome in 1593, studied mostly in her father's workshop. And then and we'll talk about it a little more, but what happened that he had many assistants or other artists that were working with him, including Agostino Tassi. Tassi was a specialist in perspective, really very good at it, and was doing architectural devices. And often when Oratio was painting, if he needed somebody to do something architectural, it would be Agostino Tassi who would do it. He thought, as Artemisia was showing a lot of talent, he directed her to him to take some lessons in perspective. And unfortunately, what happened is that she was supposed to be protected, if you want, by a woman who was living in the same building. And she, I think, intentionally closed her eyes. And so she happened to be raped by Tassi. I might as well talk about it now. So what happened is that he promised her marriage, and so he came back and back until they discovered that he was already married, had tried to kill his wife, had tried to kill his sister-in-law, He was a really very strange character. And of course, what was so precious at the time for a woman was her virginity. He'd taken the virginity and he couldn't marry her. So this was the mortal sin. So finally, Oratio is going to take him in front of the tribunal, in front of the court, to attack him for that rape. It was extremely difficult, and what was happened is that they didn't want to believe Artemisia. And as the custom was at that time, it was not the accused that would be questioned, but it was the plaintiff. And so they literally tied what they call the thumb screws. So they put some cords that they weave around her fingers, and then they tie it until the skin burst. And they did that to her, and she never reneged what she was saying. So he was condemned to some months in prison, which he barely did. He did only 2 months. And to Artemisia, really angered, he very quickly came back to Oratio's workshop and worked for him again. So following the judgment, Oratio very quickly married Artemisia to Pietro Stiastesi, and the couple moved to Florence to try to go into a more neutral territory, if you want. And at that time, Artemisia became really angry with her father. The relationship was pretty tense, so much so that once she was in Florence, she's going to sign for quite a while her paintings, not Artemisia Gentilesti, but Artemisia Lomi. This was the original name of her father. In 1616, she's joining the Accademia del Disegno in Florence, the first woman to be accepted there, though she was not allowed to attend the meetings. From 1620 to 30, she went to Genoa, Venice, came back to Rome. In 1630, moved to Naples, which became really one of her favorite places, and then joined her father in London between 1638 and 41 to assist her, together with her brothers, to paint for the king and for the Queen of England. And then she came back in 1641 to Naples and probably died. There are many dates of her death. At first, it was 1652, and now we have some proof that she was still active in 54, and we believe that she died somewhere in 55. Unfortunately, her tomb was in a church that has since been demolished, and so we have no way to see where she was buried. Because as you can believe, in the 60s, the whole idea of women, when they saw her works and the kind of paintings she was producing at that time, were very often showing that kind of tension between men and women. And it's been told that, you know, she was really painting these subject matters as a revenge on what had happened to her. She, by the way, bore 5 children in 5 years while she was in Florence. Unfortunately, 3 of them died almost at birth, and 1 young boy survived until the age of 5. And then she had 1 daughter, Prudencia, who lived with her for a long time and became a painter herself and became an adult.
And
yes.
In these paintings, what do 2 men represent, and what is?
Okay, I'm going to give you the whole story. Susanna, or Shoshana, is one of the additions to Daniel, which is considered as apocryphal by Protestant. But the story goes of that wife. She was a Hebrew wife, and she's falsely accused by these voyeurs, as you can see in the painting. She's actually bathing in her garden. She had sent her attendants away, and 2, how can you say, lusty elders, to be polite, were secretly observing her, the lovely young woman. When she made her way back to home, they stopped her on the way and blackmailed her to have intercourse with them, because otherwise they were going to go and say that she was an adulteress and that she was a bad woman. So she came in front, she refused, of course, and she was arrested and was about to be put to death for promiscuity when a young man named Daniel interrupted the proceeding, and he took the two men apart and questioned them separately. And the story goes that they couldn't identify the same tree where they were when they saw Susanna. And so they knew that they were lying and they were put to death. So the whole idea is, again, it's an excuse within the Bible to show a young lady barely dressed, which was quite nice for the young men, young and older men at the time. So this is a really nice representation of Susanna and the other, but very different to what had been shown previously. I can show you the example of Tintoretto, which shows a woman rather untouched by what's happening around her. Where here we have with Artemisia, we have far more the woman's point of view, where she's defending herself against these voyeurs. We can also see that she was influenced by Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. Here is the fresco by Michelangelo of the expulsion of Adam and Eve. It's the temptation and the expulsion. And you can see that she saw that movement of Adam, who is trying to push away from the angel who is pushing them out. And this is being just, as you can see, it's a mirror image. It was a mirror image of Adam, but very much inspired by that. That Sistine Chapel has inspired so many painters. You knew that they would just congregate there and look at all these new positions that Michelangelo had created for that beautiful ceiling. She painted, by the way, 4 other Susanna during her lifetime, one just before she died. Another subject that she's going to treat quite frequently is the idea of Judith, and in this case, and the maidservant. But if you look at the basket carried by the maidservant, you can see the head of Holofernes. This was a very grisly subject, but was very popular. It's, in this case, not showing a nude, but it was showing that humble, weak woman, by definition, that is able to vanquish a strong man with the help of God. And so the story of Judith and Holofernes is like the female pendant to David and Goliath. Those not supposed to have done what they did, but it's just the hand of God helped them, and so they were able to do it. And for example, Florence is going to take that as a kind of a leitmotif, because Florence was a rather small city compared to others, and they had been able to push away the Milanese or the people from Naples and so on. So you find many sculptures that represent this, or many paintings. They're really the heroes that you can find in Florence. In this case, everything has been done. You can see that Judith has the sword on her shoulder, and Abha, who is the servant with whom she came, has the head of Holofernes. So what is the story of Judith and Holofernes? She was a Jewish widow of noble rank in Betulia, a town that was at that time besieged by the Assyrian general Holofernes. She knew that within the town, they were short of water, short of food. They were soon to surrender, and decided at the last minute to just put her best clothes and her jewelry. She was a very obviously pretty woman, and decide to get out at night from the city and meet with Holofernes, telling him, don't worry, you don't need to besiege anymore, whatever, they're going to surrender. This is good news I'm bringing you. Holofernes was so happy about the news that he decided to organize a quick banquet, and of course he drank too much. And by the time he was completely inebriated, Judith took his sword and beheaded him. We'll see some other scenes where we see her in action. The servant who was accompanying her put the head in a basket or in a piece of cloth. They left the encampment, went back to Bethulia, and then hung the head of Holofernes at the wall of the city. In the morning, the soldiers saw that, and they got so terrified that they all left, and Bethulia was saved. So this is again the story of a weak woman, but who accomplishes something extraordinary with the help of God. More known is this painting that you can see is supposed to have been influenced by Caravaggio. Of course, Artemisia never met Caravaggio, but through her father, she was able to see many of his works. Though when you look at these two, and I have to tell you right away that the work on the right, which is attributed to Caravaggio, is still put in doubt by many because it doesn't represent the character of Caravaggio. And to me, it has always been a work compared to the strength shown by Artemisia. When you look at that, you know, or you can guess, I hope you don't know in person, but that beheading somebody with a sword is not cutting a piece of butter. It's something that requires tremendous strength. And actually not even just pushing like this, you really have to have a very strong movement before. The way she does it is like, on the right, it's almost like with two fingers out, and say, okay, I just behead him. And there's something of Caravaggio that I don't recognize, and I'm not an expert, but this is my point of view. Anyway, when you look at the work by Artemisia there, and this has been very much supported by many of the scholars, you feel that almost that revenge to say, you got me, but now I'm getting you. And it's incredibly strong. Look at the size of the arms of Artemisia. She is a strong woman. Again, beautifully saturated colors of not only Abra, but also the beautiful blue that is definitely comes from lapis lazuli. This is that very strong blue. Then the head of Holofernes there with the blood coming out is also more realistic, I think, than what you see with the Caravaggio. Here you can see her face and determination. And a very, very woman. It is, by the way, signed Lomi. By the time she was in Florence, she was introduced in many of the main households in Florence, all the important figures. And she became quite known, but also had a very, very hot affair with a man named, gentleman named Maringhi. And we have the correspondence between the two, who is borderline pornographic. Quite interesting between the two, so very close relationship that lasted about 10 years. And the husband was aware of it, but thought that it would advance her profession. So here is the X-ray. that you see there on the right. And you can see how the changes that she does, you know, in the process of painting, where she decides it's going to go that way. No, I'm going to correct it a little more this way and others. So definitely an original, because at that time, there was some ideas that she might have been held by her father, but this proves totally the opposite. She made multiple versions of the Judith and Holofernes. This is another one. And you can see again that determination of Judith, that she's going to do what she wants there, just with the help of the other, of Abra. This was not the only subject that she chose for killing a man. In this case, Sisera was a cruel Canaanite, desert leader who ruled the Israelites for 20 years. He was defeated by Baroque with 900 charioteers, and he escaped and sought refuge in the tent of Jael, a wife of Heber the Kenite. She gave the terrified man a sanctuary, and when he fell asleep, she drove a tent peg into his brain. So this act fulfilled the prediction of Deborah, prophetess and Israelite leader, who foresaw that a woman would slay Sisera. So this is again one of these subjects where you have that tension between the woman, and the woman is the winner, which is quite rare.
But this woman is not stressed out. The previous one, she's tense. This one's very relaxed. She seems to be enjoying.
No, but look, the peg is there, and she has the hammer there.
Her face. Her face is just out.
No, the face is rather soft. I give it to you. This was painted at the end of her stay in Florence. She did then a series of paintings that were allegories of either music or saints. I'm going to stop just a minute here so that allow you to have a cup of coffee or water. 5 minutes, not more. Please come back, and if you have questions, just ask, and we'll go on with Artemisia in a minute. So on Zoom, please, if you have questions, go ahead. And you can put the light on, John, can you? Thank you. No, Lomi. Lomi. But she only did it for a short period of time. Yes, Francis.
Were the nunneries allowed to live and work independently of monasteries? And
no, they had to be within. Yeah, the question was, did the nuns were the nuns able to work outside of the monastery with some exceptional permission? I'm sure they could go into churches. It was very. It was quite regulated. Yeah. But within the monasteries, you know, these were huge, and they had libraries. They were able to read. They were able, as I say, to paint, to sing, which was forbidden to women.
There's a wonderful novel, Anne, that you've probably heard of called Sacred Hearts, about a monastery of that type in Ferrara. And there was a woman there who was a healer.
Yeah.
And, yeah. So very rarely she would be called out to treat someone. Mm-hmm. As a woman, you know, no woman could be a doctor in those days.
Yeah.
She was very skilled, and it's a wonderful story about her. And the music in the convent too was also very, very renowned.
No, thank you, Cynthia. So they were women who were healers within these monasteries. but would not be allowed outside because doctors had the only permission to do so. If you think of the witches in the 17th century, 16th, 17th century, most of them were healers.
All right.
And were badly regarded by men who became very jealous of the power they had on people. A lot of
So the one in the convent was maybe the one in the convent was lucky because she was protected by her sacred status, right?
The witches were known to go in the woods and pick up herbs. And that was the whole idea. They had all these herbs that they were using for their treatments. And so whole legends, were built around these women. That's it's not a little thing that women have to come back from far away to before they come to be considered equal to men. It's interesting. And again, equal is a big word. It's comparative. We are different, but we can claim the same value. The same value that the men have. So, but when you see things like that, you know how far we come from.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, she's fascinating. And if you read about Artemisia with the books that have been written in the 60s, it's very different to the books that are written now, because a lot has been uncovered that wasn't known at that time. So for a while, she was that hero that was almost like a living version, And now they look at her differently in a very liberated woman that had very hot affairs here and there. But she, her husband disappears when she leaves Florence. So she is alone with her daughter. And there's no trace of him at all. And so she's going to be alone for the rest of her life and travel far more than any woman would do. And so she must have been a very interesting woman, probably quite voluptuous. If you look at the way she represents No, she went by herself. The only place where she joined her father was in. She didn't want to. She didn't want to. Yeah. Oh, yes. She is going to be very successful. You will see. I picked some of her works. She did far more than what I'm showing you. No, she was very successful. Yes, I mean. He was, and then as I said, he directed her to other artists that were working with him. Agostino Tassi, the guy who raped her, was one of them.
Well, it's not interesting the way we use the word. She had a hot affair. This woman was forced, she was raped, she was forced to marry another man by her father. What she found from what she loved. Yeah, and but the thing is, she had that affair for 10 years with that guy. When it became very widespread, really known in France, she left and went to Rome because he was married and had, and so it was very hot. No, by what I tell you, by what some of these letters between them say, it's wow. So can you?
Her letters are published. Where would I find her letters?
I'll try to look into that. There must be some books that are mentioned too. I'm going to mute you, and we'll talk at the end. Okay, so we go on with Artemisia. And this is actually a self-portrait of her where she represents a lute player. Now, this is, again, lute player can be an allegory of music, but we not quite sure of what it's supposed to mean. It was part of the inventory of the Villa Medici in Artemino in 1638. So most probably was commissioned or bought by the Medici family. She represents herself there as a gypsy. The turban that she wears in her hair and the low décolletage that she has was more typical of a gypsy than just a regular musician. It probably wouldn't be quite comfortable for a musician to be that way. And the gypsies would often perform into courts because they were talented, they would dance, they would play and sing. Now, the way she has, if you look at her hands, which are beautifully painted, by the way, some of the most difficult things to paint is hands. They show that she knew the instrument because the way her fingers are absolutely perfectly placed. And also the detail of the lute shows that she probably owned one and might have been a musician too, as many people at that time with some education would have multiple talents. Okay. So a little similar to the previous one is here her self-portrait as Saint Catherine of Alexandria. Of course, we have in the corner, lower left corner, the famous wheel, which is the symbol of Saint Catherine, and she's carrying the palm, which shows that she was a martyr. This is actually a painting, as you can see, that has been acquired recently by the Uffizi and displayed. So that now we know that Artemisia for the first time has been included in the collection. It has actually set a record. It was sold in 2017 for the sum of €2,360,000. No, euros, sorry, euros, at l'Hôtel Drouot, so in Paris, and was bought by the Uffizi, who quickly rushed to try to catch one Artemisia Gentilesti to be able to display it. One of her known subjects, and this was a subject that was very much loved by many painters, including her father, and as we know, including Caravaggio before that, is the penitent Mary Magdalene. Here she's shown as a courtesan by the beauty of her dress and the fact that her hair is quite visible. Again, the low décolletage, but on the other hand, she's almost kneeling, and that shows that she's starting to repent from her sins. Of course, this was a way that Mary Magdalene was presented during that time, because as we know by now that Mary Magdalene was one of the favorite around Christ and was not a prostitute or a courtesan at all. She was actually supposed to be a well-learned person, but has been used by the church as that second Eve that represents us all, sinning women that we are, aren't we? But again, the way she treats that beautiful light on the yellow garment is extraordinary. And that muted red at the back. Then, as we know, she moved to Genoa, went to Venice. It's very little documented, so we don't have really any ideas of the work that she did. It's very difficult. Probably Many are still there, dormant, attributed to other people. So we have difficulties following her movement in the late 20s. We know she was in search of richer commission in Venice. In Genoa, she did this work of the condottiero, who is, and unfortunately, as you can see, it comes from a palace collection and a very bad reproduction of the painting, unfortunately. We know that there are a lot of poetry and letters that were composed in appreciation of her and her works in Venice. And this one is signed and dated. She went then to Naples and started doing a whole series of painting, not only religious, but we will see too some that starting to move towards the genre painting. Again, this is something that comes from the north and that had been also used by Caravaggio. This is an Annunciation. Again, we can only admire the beauty of the light and the impact on the figures, the composition, which is extremely pleasant, and the pure diagonal, so typical of the early Baroque.
And
Yes,
is there a message on a piece of paper?
probably her signature.
Oh,
That would be, this was a device to be able to have a readable signature. Cleopatra, so this is one more of the paintings where she shows woman giving herself death. We will have a few examples. This is the moment where you can see the aspic snake on the bed sheet by which Cleopatra has just been bit and is going to die. This gives us, again, this is a very different standard of beauty from Artemisia than what we've seen from men. Typically, Artemisia's women are very robust, very strong. And this leads almost to Rubens when you look at it. You know, it's quite interesting to see that evolution where Cleopatra shown by a man would be much thinner. It's a very different standard of beauty. And you see this until the 1980s was thought to be the work of Massimo Stanzione. Now most of them believe that it is her work and it could be done with the collaboration of her pupil, Onofrio Palumbo. But I think they also found some signs that shows that it's hers. And then some semi-genre scenes. It's supposed to be the birth of John the Baptist, but this is set now in that everyday house setting. It's not that semi, mythological background or whatever, but here is just a regular family with a newborn. The whole concept of washing the baby. You have the father who is signing his name after he was born. And then the very beautiful little window that shows the landscape in the background. This was part of a 6-painting portrayal of St. John's life by different painters, and she was one of them. This was commissioned by the Viceroy of Naples, the Conde de Monterrey. She was apparently by that time really known to be a feminist painter and really appreciated as such. This will be a very influential type of painting. There is a group of French painters that were in Naples at that time and are going to be influenced by her style. Lot and his daughter So according to the book of Genesis, the pious Lot and his family were advised by angels to flee the city of Sodom before God destroyed it for its sinfulness. Lot's wife famously disobeyed God's command not to look back at the burning city and was transformed in a pillar of salt. Believing their family to be the last people on earth, the daughter conspired to continue the human race by getting their father drunk and seducing him. And this is what you see. What is interesting is that it's a rather softer message. Lot is not ridiculed. It's done kind of with gentleness, but this was, of course, one of the big seduction stories of the Bible. But again, we can admire the use of that contrast of blue and yellow that she takes from her father, that extraordinary color scheme. David and Bathsheba, this is the story, of course, of David who falls in love with the wife of one of his general. She is bathing again, and so another way of showing a woman in the nude. And then David is up above in the palace and lurching at her. He is going to manage to send, yes?
When you sent the list of pictures you're going to show today, I checked this Bathsheba on Google, because I never heard it, and I found paintings by 20 different.
Oh, I know. It was one of the big,
I
yeah.
was puzzled because some of the paintings, I would say that they are Playboy cover material, because the woman.
Yeah, but that's the whole idea.
Beautiful, full breasts and just little covering the genital area. And when you read, it's David falling in love or in lust after this woman.
Yeah.
When he sees her taking back, they marry.
Yeah,
The son is Solomon.
yes,
And the continuation is the genealogy of Jesus.
yeah.
And I think, why is this connection? Why are people so fascinated with this figure?
Yeah, but this is again one example where you can legitimately show a woman barely dressed. But it's because it's part of the Bible, you could do it without shocking people. But it's pure hypocrisy.
Oh, some of the paintings are just.
No, the gorgeous, I don't deny that. But I mean, it's again one of these examples of subject matter that allows the painter to show a naked woman legitimately for the time. Otherwise, he couldn't. You couldn't just show, Miss America in the nude on the painting and that would be accepted. It wouldn't.
So what would happen to them what would happen to one of these people if they did that? If they painted?
It would probably be destroyed.
Oh.
It could not. It's really in the 19th century that we start seeing Olympia by Manet is the big first, if you want, where he shows a woman who is not a goddess, and he shows her in the nude and she's facing you with kind of a little smile saying, I know who I am.
Yeah, so they wouldn't be arrested or something.
Yeah,
Yes,
they would deal with the church and the Inquisition and everything.
Oh.
That is that they might not be displayed, they might not be recognized and shown by the academies if they were too much nudity or the wrong nudity, or they would cover them with and not allow the women to see them.
Yeah, because women were not supposed to see
Women
nudity, and men for sure. And so, but this was, just the tradition. You could show what was a goddess, Venus, and then these biblical scenes, because that was part of the book and so on. But you could not show the next door prostitute in the nude on a painting without having an allegory that would just make it legitimate. It's pure hypocrisy. Yes.
And you couldn't show the version of your feet or your painting.
Exactly. So when Caravaggio shows the girl, it's refused. So you could, but it would not be accepted to be put in the church as they wanted, despite the fact they were Discalced Carmelite. Absolutely. Okay, so again, this is the example. And as John mentioned, Bathsheba, of course, her husband is going to be sent to battle. He's going to die. And then David can legitimately marry Bathsheba, and she will become the mother of Solomon. One of the most famous and the most commented work by Artemisia is her self-portrait as the allegory of painting. And this is an absolutely beautiful work, not only in the handling of the perspective, that the way of the face position, but the light is absolutely superb. It is evident that Charles I owned at least 3 paintings by her, and this might have been part of it. This work was sold after the execution of the king in 1649, but then was recovered at the time of the Restoration. He didn't commission the work, apparently, but she might have painted it for herself. Rubens did the same, by the way. He painted the self-portrait, and the king fell in love with that portrait. He had to paint a copy of it to give it to the king. So this is, again, an allegory. So it represents the whole idea, the personification of painting. And it's really interesting. It's very close to the precepts of Cesare Ripa with iconologia, iconologia that he wrote in 1611, that was giving a whole series of attributes for each of the allegories. And in this case, it's a female figure with disheveled hair, wearing a gold chain with a medallion. So this is what Cesare Ripa writes, and this is what she shows herself with. So as we mentioned, she went to London to help her father. She actually helped him already for another painting that was in a palace that burned since Whitehall. And in this case, this is the painting that she did for the Queen's House in Greenwich, now Marlborough House. This is quite a feat when you think about it. The fact that her father, who was an old man at that time, was climbing on scaffolding to do this painting is quite remarkable. And this represents the allegory of peace and the arts under the English crown. She, from England, decided then to go back to Naples, and this is where she settled for good. Shows again, this is another Bathsheba with a slightly different setting, a little more, how can I say, energetic in the sense that you have the movement of the woman carrying the water, the other woman there taking some, I'm not sure what she's putting out. And then you have, of course, David looking from the balcony. She died in Naples, as I mentioned, probably around 55. There was a stone, allegedly a stone with just hic Artemisia. But in the 19th century, somebody went to that church and couldn't find it. And unfortunately, the church was demolished in the 20th century. So everything is forgotten. An interesting anonymous epitaph was written. By painting one likeness after another, I earned no end of merit in the world. While to carve 2 horns upon my husband's head, I put down the brush and took a chisel instead. Heart-side gentlewoman, I was never to anyone who was able to see me in the unseeing world. But now that hid beneath this marble slab I lie, allure turns to bait, and gentle worm eaten am I. It's unfortunately anonymous. Now, as I mentioned, lately, a lot of new painting of hers have come to the surface, and I'm going to show you a few. This is a painting representing Lucretia giving herself, killing herself. And this came back on the art market and was sold at the auction house Art Curial in France on the 13th of November 2019 for the sum of 4,777,000 euros, establishing the record, the world record for Artemisia. This work that was acquired by a London merchant has then since been acquired in 2021 by the Getty Museum and is now at the Getty. One of the, again, another of the last one showing David and Goliath. It's in the private collection. It was bought in 2018 at the auction house Hampel and bought only 404,000 euros. It was previously attributed to Giovanni Francesco Guerrieri, who was one of the students of Oratio. And while cleaning it, they found the signature of Artemisia. So that was a good price for an Artemisia. And then the last one is Mary Magdalene in ecstasy. And I think this is incredibly powerful because it's so sensual. This was discovered in France in a private collection. And you can see how she throws her head backwards in full ecstasy. Almost you think of the Bernini of Saint Teresa in ecstasy. So besides Oratio and Artemisia, there was definitely an international influence by Caravaggio on other painters. Some are quite entertaining. The little, what we call bent Virgos, they're actually followers of Piet van Laar, who was also called Il Bamboccio. It means, Bamboccio means a little clumsy one. He had a deformed body, but these bent Virgos were all Flemish and Dutch painters that came down to Italy and respected their own tradition of good drinking, good singing, and good eating. Were quite, I think, a noisy group. And this is shown here. They are in a tavern where you can see they drawing on the wall, and they all drinking heavily and being quite obnoxious. They were specialists in scenes of street life in Rome. They took also the name of bent Virgos, which means birds of a feather. As I say, mostly Dutch and Flemish, active in Rome between 620 and 720, and painted scenes that you could have seen with Caravaggio, such as this one by a Frenchman who joined the group too, Valentin de Boulogne. And these were these early works that Caravaggio had produced with people playing cards or playing music and so on. And there's quite a series. Unfortunately, most of the time, they're not as valuable. The Valentin de Boulogne did some really wonderful work, and I hope to show him when I talk about the Versailles and the French. They were also the Caravaggisti. And Caravaggisti are painters that follow Caravaggio, but can come from different countries. So one of the main originally Spanish one is Giuseppe de Ribera, who was called Il Spagnolo in Naples, and who produced a whole series of extraordinary painting that, because Naples belonged to the Spaniards at that time, were going straight back to Spain, and really diffused at that time the style of Caravaggio in Spain. And so Zurbarán and other painters were quite influenced. Velázquez himself came to Rome and Naples and so saw it by himself and was influenced also by Rubens. But these are definitely works that were incredibly influenced by Caravaggio. In the north, in the Netherlands, we have a group of painters that are called themselves the Caravaggistes, and we'll talk about them next year. We have Hendrik ten Terbruggen here showing that young flute player. Just the angles and the subject matter were very familiar to Caravaggio. Or Gerrit van Honthorst, also from the region of Utrecht. These painters were either went to Italy themselves or were influenced by others that had been there. And these are very typical of these Jean Racine, the Procuress, which actually has a direct relationship with the prodigal son, where often it shows a scene where the prodigal son is wasting his money with girls and so on. The beautiful light of the candle that illuminates the young woman. And the lute, you see, sexual connotation with the lute. In France, we have l'Atelier du Midi Caravagesque, which is a workshop in the south that was in Provence, where a whole series of painters got together and painted in the style of Caravaggio. Now, with Louis Vincent comes another of these controversy, because he worked with Caravaggio in Naples and then went back to France. Caravaggio left with him and another friend 3 paintings that were supposed to be sent to Scipione Borghese in Rome, and because he owed them money, and so they were going to recover some of the money, and then they were supposed to send it to him when it's in Rome. But Louis Vincent also, there is big controversy because people believe that Louis Vincent painted some of the Judith and Holofernes, including the one I showed you before. This is another of the Judith, and this is Judith de Toulouse, which is almost identical to Caravaggio that is in Naples. So there is big controversy here. This painting was making the headlines in 2016. It was discovered in 2014 in the attic of a house in the region of Toulouse. And that ties in with the talk I gave the other day on Napoleon, because there is great belief that the ancestor of that family was one of the officers of Napoleon. And we know that the officers looted some works in Italy too. So that thing was hidden in the attic. So why not taking it down if it was such a beautiful painting? So anyway, they brought it down, they had it certified. Everybody said it's either a Fasson or a Caravaggio, but they're not sure. And just before it went into auction, 2 days before the auction took place, the painting was sold to an American collector for a, I have the amount here. The reserve was at 30 million euro. And the painting sold to, we don't have the price that was agreed between the collector and the auctioneer. But it happens that that collector is also on the board of the Metropolitan. So one day it will end up probably to be visible. As they say, this would be a very expensive price for a Fasson, but a good price for a Caravaggio. So thank you so much. Happy Thanksgiving. And then we'll see one other Oh, sorry, I have to stop. No, it doesn't work. I have to do.
Thank you, Anne.